welcome to another episode of Story Boudoir. I'm Katy Gathright.
And I'm Samantha Neugebauer.
And today, per usual, we're going to be talking about another short story. Our show is always focused on one short story, and then, we get to eat treats afterwards. Yes. But today, we will be talking about a story by Elif Batuman called The Board Will Decide If I'm Qualified to Live in the Basement. And it was published recently in Electric Lit, so it's a newer story. You can check it out in the link below. But yeah, I think we're excited to get into it today.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so to describe this story is a little bit of an odd exercise. It is a little bit of a surreal story, and I think you kind of have to, read it to really get a sense of the tone. I should say we will be having spoilers, as we always do on our episodes. But the story is essentially about a protagonist who shows up looking for an apartment. She's on an apartment search, and we meet her when she is in an unnamed city, and we know that she's meeting up with a broker outside of this building, and he then kind of takes her inside the building on this I would say journey to kind of see what the unit looks like. It's sort of a strange journey. The rooms are described in succession. They end up in a unit that is like, you have to climb down a ladder to get into it. There's no windows. It's sort of
it's a nightmare.
Yeah, it's a nightmare. It's like not where you would want to live. And one of the things that's been teed up is that we're going to meet the seller, and you have to decide if the seller is going to agree to sell this apartment to you. So that's kind of step one. And the seller, she thinks he's a dog at first, but actually it's a human in the corner. So that's kind of a flavor of what you see in this story. That's step one. And then step two is appearing before the board, the board of this, I guess, like condo building.
Titular board,
Yes. And then the kind of back half of the story is the sort of like long back and forth where the board is sort of berating her and saying that she's not good enough to live there. And she's sort of trying to plead her case. Eventually, basically is forced to give up and then exits or attempts to exit the building, and it's left a little bit on a ambiguous note. So yeah, it's a strange little story, and I think it's hard to kind of recap the tone like I was saying, but one of the things I was struck by is, despite the sort of, or maybe because of the kind of darkness of the story, and I'm sure we'll get into that more, it's a funny, quirky story. I found it to be like funny in several places and kind of throughout. And so I'm curious what you think about the humor in this story. Like, did you find it funny? Was that something you liked or that you felt meshed with the tone of the story? What were your reactions to that?
Yeah, I definitely think there are some funny lines and funny exchanges in it. I think one of the best ones is one that you really like too, where she walks first into this, very nice unit. And she kind of remarks that, oh, I thought it was a basement unit. Like, you're not underground yet. And the broker says, what is it, like, you shouldn't assume it was, something like you shouldn't assume that it was that it was underground. And she says, surely the custom of putting the basement on the bottom floor has a venerable, even an ancient history. And I think that's quite funny. I think there are several other lines like that. But the story overall, I think, cannot be described as funny because I don't find the story cathartic. I think that ultimately this is not a romp.
No.
In any way. So I admire how there are these like bits of humor in it. But this is a different kind of project.
I know. I'm really trying to puzzle through that because I totally agree. I mean, this is a story where, I think that line, I agree. It struck me as funny. I think the narrator kind of has this like elevated tone and sort of the sort of like wryness of it feels funny in a lot of places. But like some of the funny moments ish are like she, I think in the very beginning of the story, mistakes the broker for like a bush. And then like later when she's in the building, she mistakes, like I said, the seller of the unit, of the kind of horrible basement unit, as a dog. And they're both described as like emaciated people, which is also interesting. But it's sort of like, it's like, oh, like, haha, but it's like, oh, it's not a dog, it's a human. But like, that's like horrible, you know, and I agree that this story, in the end, it like doesn't want to be a romp, but I think it is interested in pulling you through. Like, I think some stories that are not a romp, like sort of are sort of disdainful of the reader experience.
Absolutely.
And this feels like one that kind of wants you to be a little bit titillated along the way.
Absolutely. And, you know, it's not, it's something that is kind of known about her work, that she likes to kind of stand on the shoulders of giants, right? So she does that in both her novels, in her essay collection, and, you know, this story is very, very easily identifiable as Kafkaesque. And I think it's also true with Kafka that, you know, these are kind of bleak scenarios that he is putting the reader in, but there is a real kind of urge to entertain in the writing as well, and I think you get that here, which I think is great.
Absolutely. That's a good way to put it.
And so I guess thinking more about maybe why we chose the story, which isn't always something that we talk about, but we both read a lot of recently published short fiction, and as Katie said in the beginning, this is the second you know, recently published story that we've chosen. And so, you know, what stood out for you in the story amongst kind of, you know, all the stories that you've been reading lately? Why, you know, Katie was the one who found this for us. Why did you bring this to our show?
Yeah, sure. And I'm glad, of course, that you bring up the Kafka thing about it. I wouldn't say that's like consciously what I was thinking, but I do think there's something about this story that is feels like very like unafraid to be like both like operating in a symbolic register, but with a very like grounded narrative voice. Like, I think I read a lot of stories that are super interested in realism, or they're like super interested in sort of being dystopic, or they're super interested in being like unsettling and disorienting. And I think this is like that kind of strange or like unusual story for me that is both like grounded and dystopic and surreal all at the same time. And I was kind of interested in that formula of like a story that is like fine with disorienting you and withholding a lot of key details, but is like also interested in being like navigable. Like, you know, it's not difficult to understand. Like, it's very much like we're in this room and then we're in that room. Like, I'm interested in that ability to make something feel defamiliarized without while also kind of tending to like readerly pleasure.
Yeah, I think that I share a lot of your feelings with this, and I would almost want to say that this story is ambitious in a way that I like, in a way that people typically, when they say something's ambitious, it's also a little bit of a put down. Like it tried. And it's like not cool to try, you know, right now anyway, unfortunately, for strivers. And I think that and I think that I say it without kind of any, you know, ulterior motive, that this is an ambitious story, and that is why I like it. Totally. You know, I think that I feel, and we'll get into this, I feel like there was a bit of maybe a missed opportunity or two in this. But I would rather a story that's ambitious with a missed opportunity or two than another story, you know, that sounds a lot like stories.
I agree. It's almost like, and again, if you read like The Idiot or either or, like you would recognize like some of the like intellectual tone of it. Like it has this like a smart narrator who kind of speaks in a smart way. But I feel like it's ambitious in that the story doesn't like rely on that voice and that voice alone. You know, I think we talk about that like voicey stories and like
it's
kind of like all they have.
Yeah.
It's almost like the voice is there, but it's actually, it feels pretty contained. Like it doesn't like take over the story. There's a lot of other elements at play.
Yeah, we almost get the voice in the beginning where, it's using, distinctive vocabulary, like the trees are ailing, right? We get, very specific descriptions of like someone's dress attire and those kind of things. And we just know the character is intelligent.
Yeah.
But we're not going to waste time, like, she's not going to waste time proving it to you any more than that.
Yeah, totally agree. Yeah. And I think, along lines of ambition, I mean, I was curious what you think about the politics of this story, essentially. Like, we, again, are kind of in a, like, symbolic or parable-like register a bit where we've got, like, a buyer and a seller and a broker, and there's sort of, like, this, like, world building of economy happening. And certainly, like, there's sort of like this backdrop of like, oh, like you are trying so hard and hustling so hard to live in this like horrible apartment.
Right.
Yeah, I'm curious, like, did the politics feel, is that where you feel like there's a missed opportunity potentially?
So I think that, first of all, I am all here for the symbolic. I think that's super interesting. I really like the idea of kind of people being their surroundings at the same time. Like, the broker is a piece of shrubbery, and the man who owns the apartment is this pile of cashmere. Like, that is all really interesting to me. I think in one way this story is operating on this super symbolic level that is reminiscent of Kafka in this way that is really exciting. And then I think it has, for me anyway, it has to be said that the story feels much more of a response to our times rather than like illuminating of our times necessarily. Like, I don't feel like I walked away like thinking about the problem of housing in urban Western cities any differently, honestly. I do think that the symbolism of when she starts to descend the ladder into the basement unit was really, honestly, spooky for me. And I'm not someone who's like afraid of ladders or anything, but like I didn't like that. Like I didn't like the feeling of that. But I do feel, for me, one of the places where this missed the mark a little bit was that the voice is contained, right, in a way that makes it so it's not this voicey piece, and the voice is everything. But I felt maybe the voice was like a little bit too contained sometimes, in that I didn't really know who this person was at all. And even in like Kafka's novels or in the Metamorphosis, we know a little bit more about the speaker. My favorite Kafka novel is The Castle, and in that we kind of know the character K is, he works with land and properties, and there's a reason for his like existence in the place, this little town surrounding the castle, that like makes sense. And for me, I struggled with understanding like the raison d'etre of this character in this place. Like, why did they have to be here?
Yeah.
And for me, that was a little bit of a struggle because at one point we're told like this person's family is relying on them to be there. And then I'm like, wow, like, is this like, a migrant worker? Like, I was thinking of the horrific story a couple years ago about, the flooding in Queens, flooded many basement units and killed several workers, which was terrible. But then for a lot of it, I felt like, oh no, this is like a New York girlie like wants to work in media. And like the voice was almost too vague for me for it to be more meaningful.
I see that. And I think that like when you're talking, I agree with that moment when it's relatively late that we learn like she's sort of there. Like her family's like hopes are pinned on her. I feel like that's one of those moments where like this is kind of like workshoppy, but where like a professor might be like, this is where the story broke open for me, like more there. And I do think it is, you almost get, it's almost a little bit like the story withholds to be cool
Right.
about that. Whereas like maybe what would be like better is like just knowing more and letting the story follow that.
I think so, because I feel like we're not all in the same boat when it comes to the housing issue, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like it almost, by not defining who the person is, gives the impression that like this story believes like we're all kind of in it together with housing being expensive. But I mean, if you read the New York real estate section where someone says like they have $900,000 to spend on a unit, and then like 6 paragraphs down it's like after a small inheritance, it's like so this is not that person, or is it that person? I don't know.
Right.
And it doesn't matter. I would follow either story because everyone.
But it matters that it doesn't matter which.
It matters for the politics.
Yeah.
That's it. Like I just think that either story could be interesting.
Yeah.
But now it's neither.
Yeah. No, I think that's really well put. Yeah. I agree with that.
And so I guess my question is like pretty related to that, which is just sort of on the flip side, what are the benefits maybe of withholding kind of more information about the protagonist? And what do you kind of like, is this a relatable protagonist for readers, or is it meant to be? Is it supposed to even be like a real person?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I mean, I think because like to your point, I feel like one of the like standard reasons maybe you might withhold information is so that your protagonist can be like an everyman, or you can just like they're blanks, you project yourself onto them. And I think there is a part of that maybe a little bit here where like you were kind of along. It's a little bit of a claustrophobic story too, right? So you're like very much like along for the journey. Like you said, you were uncomfortable descending into that room. But I don't know. I also think there's a way in which like, well, I do actually ultimately think that relatability is a little bit important here. I think about the like shoe issue. Like early in the story, she sort of says like, "Oh, I'm glad I wore like my wore these shoes instead of my like more uncomfortable Chelsea boots." And I remember kind of tripping up over that detail because I was like, Chelsea boots, that feels like very like, I don't know, realist. I don't want to know about like Chelsea boots in this universe.
Absolutely. It was like a name drop.
Yeah, it was like, we always talk about how like sometimes brands can be distracting. This just felt like that. But anyway. And then later, though, when she's before the board, one of the things the board like really berates her for is wearing sneakers. And that was where I was like, okay, the payoff for that is satisfying, because I'm like, that is very relatable. Like in trying to trying to be appropriate, you have ended up being inappropriate.
Yes.
Like in trying to wear the right shoes for like an apartment search day, you have ended up being like mocked for that very thing. And I think, obviously that's like it feels like a trivial example, but like it's like quite important to the plot of this story. And like that does feel like it like touches something for me, where I'm like, that is a very specific feeling and frustration where like you are exactly, and trying to avoid one pitfall and trying to be one step ahead, you are actually doing the very thing that brings about your downfall. So I think in some ways too, like paring back the biological information the biographical information allows details like the shoes to like take up more space and like matter more, and like in some ways that might be more emotionally resonant than like me knowing that she grew up in Idaho or something.
I think that's absolutely true. And I think that one thing I was thinking about this story was that idea that Milan Kundera puts in The Art of the Novel, which is that the European novel is like more interested in external causation than the Western American novel or short story, I guess. And he's talking right through Kafka, and this is definitely a story that is interested in the effects of external things on the person. We basically are in the character's headspace only when she is kind of thinking about the tone of voice of the board members, or what they said. we don't get a lot of her own thoughts ever, and that feels very purposeful. And I think it contributes to that suffocating feeling a little bit. It feels very anxious almost, right? Like I am overly thinking about this person's tone of voice. I'm being vigilant.
Yeah.
Because I am not in control here, and I'm trying so desperately to control something.
Yeah, it's like you're in reactive mode, survival mode, as opposed to like, it's when you relax maybe that you can like
absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that if that is the project of the story, then that makes a lot of sense to me. But I still wouldn't mind this being expanded into a novel and getting to know this person a little bit more, maybe.
Yeah, it's totally fair. More is more. Ambitious.
Yes.
Well, we can talk about our favorite lines
Mm-hmm.
now, and mine is the following.
Okay.
Finally, I saw the face of Eveline, our standard poodle. I saw her customary hopeful expression of ready intelligence. I saw her eyes full of pleading, as they had been at our last encounter. Yeah. And this is like in the context of when she sees the seller, again, she thought the seller was a dog, turns out to be a seller. Mm-hmm. When she thought the seller was a dog, she was excited because she was like, basically like, I loved my childhood poodle, and this reminds me of that. Yeah. And I like these lines here because, again, I think they're a good example of how the voice can be a little bit pared back. Mm-hmm. Like it's a little bit, it's still like kind of irreverent, but it's not too much. And then also, I think it's a good example of how this story kind of goes from, it elides like the humor and the darkness, you know? Yeah. So it's like, again, you're sort of just reeling from realizing that like this person is actually, or this dog is actually a person.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And then you're getting this like little like tantalizing tidbit about the past. Right. And I think again, because there's so few details, you're like, oh, I'm curious about your family poodle. Mm-hmm. But then like, so it's sort of like, oh, this is how lovely you're thinking about your like intelligent eyes of your dog. Yeah. But then it kind of turns in that last half sentence, like, I saw her eyes full of pleading, as they had been at our last encounter. Right. And then you're like, oh, all right, this is when you like put your dog down or whatever. You know, it suddenly goes in this like very dark direction very quickly, and I just think it's deft how that happens within a very like economical space.
Absolutely, I agree. I also really like that one. Okay, so mine is from a member of the board. So our protagonist is making her case for why she should be allowed to buy this unit, and the board is not having it. And this is what they say. Okay, precisely, not to live here. And what is life? Where is life? Where is it sustainable? To allow life where life cannot be sustained is an irresponsibility. And so our responsibility, the responsibility of the board, is not just to the tenants, but to the city itself. So I both found this line to be absolutely fascinating and also a little bit of my second missed opportunity here.
Sure.
Fascinating because this is such a strong declarative statement that shows the value of this board, right? At first I thought, oh, this is just a word salad. Yeah. But then at the end where it's like, our responsibility is not just to the board, but or to the tenants, but to the city itself. I was just like in, a daze of questions, like, what do they mean? What is the city? Yeah. Is the city that's people? Is it the people? Is it the streets? Is the sidewalks? What does this mean? And I actually had this very dark thought about something that had happened in Philadelphia, where I'm from. During the racial reckoning, the protest, there was a headline in the Philadelphia Inquirer that said, and it was very, very controversial, as it should have been, that buildings matter too, during the protests. And it turned out that the writer of the article, disavowed the headline, that they didn't create it. But her point being, when you read the article, that in a lot of areas that were undergoing a lot of looting and kind of different destruction during the protests, that the people who lived there would be affected for a generation, right? Yeah. And it's still controversial, even with that explanation. But I was really fascinated by what this meant. What is the city? It felt it could possibly be, it could be anti-immigrant, it could be anti-newcomer, it could be something about class. Like, I don't know what it means, but it really had me spinning. And the way that it felt like the tiniest of missed opportunities is that I just wish we got the thoughts of our protagonists, just one thought, right? Because then we kind of have a line break and flip. And I feel like, again, if this was a classroom, I feel if we were the professors in that class, we would tell our students, like, press there just for a minute.
Yeah, totally. I love that point. It almost makes me feel like if you watched our last episode about James Salter's American Express, like, we brought up you quoted the whiff of the metaphysical, and I feel like this is a moment where the story is like kind of asking bigger questions, and has a chance, is like kind of going there, but maybe like not quite to your point.
It's so good. I just wanted more.
Yeah. So if you want to read a story and feel like you want more of it, we recommend you checking this one out. But I feel like that's a good discussion for today.
Wonderful. And we hope to see you next time.
Yeah. Take care.